4:15 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz, USS Mason, was already cutting through the black water at 20 knots. The acoustic signature on the sonar screen was something the operator had never seen in 3 years of service. Something was moving in the deep channel that did not belong to the tide or the local traffic. The air over the flight deck was heavy with the smell of salt and diesel. Beneath the surface, the cold current moved against the hull like a living thing. The question was no longer if they were being watched, but how many eyes were fixed on the American destroyer. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was frozen. Blue light from the consoles washed over the faces of the technicians. Sonar technician Second Class Miller pressed his headsets closer to his ears. He closed his eyes. He listened to the rhythm of the ocean. He heard the distant thrum of a civilian tanker 5 miles to the north. He heard the clicking of shrimp. Then, he heard it. It was a rhythmic, metallic pulse. It was the sound of a screw turning through the water with precision. Bridge. Combat. We have a submerged contact. Bearing 080. Range 9,000 yards, Miller said. His voice was flat. It was the voice of a man reciting a grocery list, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. Combat. Bridge. Acknowledge contact. Can you classify? Miller looked at the waterfall display on his screen. The lines were jagged and sharp. They were too clean for a biological contact. He adjusted the gain. The signal clarified. Then, another line appeared beside the first. Then a third. Bridge, combat. Correcting previous report. We have 3 distinct signatures. They are running in a tight diamond formation. Classification is probable diesel-electric submarines. Speed 6 knots. Depth 100 meters. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. In the Strait of Hormuz, 3 submarines running silent and deep in a diamond formation was not a routine patrol. It was an ambush profile. On the bridge, Captain James Vance gripped the edge of the cold steel chart table. He did not look out the windows. There was nothing to see but the black expanse of the Gulf and the distant, flickering lights of the Omani coast. He looked at the tactical display. The 3 contacts were positioned perfectly to box the Mason in against the shallows of the Iranian coast. Set general quarters, Vance ordered. Go to Condition 1 ASW. I want the helicopter in the air 5 minutes ago. The ship erupted into a controlled chaos. The alarm for general quarters began its rhythmic, electronic shriek. It was a sound designed to cut through sleep and fatigue. All across the USS Mason, sailors hit the deck. They did not run. They moved with the practiced, frantic speed of a crew that had drilled this transition 1,000 times. Boots hammered on the non-skid flooring of the passageways. Heavy steel hatches slammed shut and were dogged down with a metallic clang that echoed through the hull. In the hangar, the maintenance crew tore the chocks from the wheels of the MH-60R helicopter. The pilot was already in the cockpit, flicking switches with a gloved hand. The twin engines began to whine. The sound rose in pitch, a mechanical scream that filled the enclosed space. The smell of burning jet fuel flooded the hangar. The massive doors slid open, revealing the dark, humid night of the Gulf. Back in the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the 3 green dots on his screen. They were no longer moving at 6 knots. Contacts are increasing speed, the officer reported. They're at 12 knots. They are turning toward us. Range is now 7,000 yards. They are closing the door, Vance said. He stepped onto the bridge wing. The wind whipped at his uniform. The sea was a dark, churning mass. He could feel the vibration of the ship's 4 gas turbine engines through the soles of his boots. The Mason was a powerful machine, a billion-dollar instrument of war, but against 3 submarines in the narrow straits, she was a target. The submarines were Iranian Ghadir-class vessels. They were small, they were quiet. In the cluttered, noisy environment of the Strait of Hormuz, they were nearly invisible. They were designed for this exact moment. They were designed to sit in the shadows and wait for a giant to pass. Bridge. Combat. We have a transient, Miller shouted over the internal comms. Sounds like outer door openings. Contact 1 is flooded. They are preparing to fire. Vance did not hesitate. The rules of engagement in the straits were clear, but the reality of 3 torpedo tubes opening within 7,000 yards changed the math instantly. "Weapons free," Vance said. "Activate the Mark 54 battery. Tell the Seahawk to drop the moment they have a fix. We are not waiting to see what they have in those tubes." The ship heeled hard to port as the helmsman brought the Mason about. The wake of the destroyer tore through the water, a white scar on the Black Sea. The hunt had begun. 4:20 in the morning. The air over the flight deck was a cyclone of heat and noise. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter hovered just 10 feet above the rolling deck of the USS Mason. The rotor blades sliced through the humid night air, creating a rhythmic, thumping pressure that rattled the teeth of the deck crew. White spray from the sea rose up in a fine mist, coating the windshield of the aircraft in a layer of salt. With a final surge of power from its twin engines, the helicopter lifted away from the destroyer. It banked hard to the east, its navigation lights blinking once before they were extinguished. The aircraft vanished into the blackness, leaving only the fading scream of its turbines behind. Inside the cockpit of the MH-60 Sierra, the world was reduced to the green glow of night vision goggles and the steady hum of the avionics. The sensor operator in the back seat leaned over his console. He checked the status of the dipping sonar. 5 miles out from the Mason, the operator said, transitioning to hover, deploying the transducer. The helicopter slowed to a stationary position 40 feet above the water. A heavy, cylindrical sensor, the AN/AQS-22 dipping sonar, was lowered from the belly of the aircraft on a high-strength cable. It hit the surface with a splash and sank quickly into the depths. The cable unspooled, humming as it carried the sensor down through the thermal layers of the Strait of Hormuz. 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. Transducer is at depth, the operator reported. Going active. The first pulse went out. It was a high-frequency chirp that traveled through the water at 1,500 meters per second. The sound waves struck the hulls of the submerged targets and bounced back, carrying vital information about their shape, size, and speed. On the screen, 3 bright white dots flared into existence. Contact. 3 hulls confirmed. They are Ghadir-class midget submarines. They are spread out now. They are no longer in a diamond formation. They are flanking us. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the report from the helicopter was met with grim silence. Captain Vance stared at the tactical plot. The 3 green icons representing the submarines were drifting apart, moving like the fingers of a hand reaching out to grasp the destroyer. "They are moving into a spread," Vance said. "They want to fire from multiple angles. They know we can't track all 3 at once if they get behind the acoustic shadows of the tankers." The ship's hull groaned as the Mason increased speed to 30 knots. The vibration of the engines was a constant, low-frequency roar that moved through the steel decks and into the bones of every sailor on board. The smell of ozone and hot electronics filled the Combat Information Center. Miller, the sonar operator, kept his hands steady on his controls. He switched the ship's hull-mounted sonar to active mode. Ping. The sound echoed through the entire ship. It was a sharp, metallic strike, like a hammer hitting a cathedral bell. Ping. Every man on the ship felt it in their chest. It was the sound of the Mason announcing her presence to the world. It was a challenge. "I have them," Miller shouted. "Contact 1 is at bearing 075, range 5,000 yards. Contact 2 is at 090, range 5,200. Contact 3 is lost in the wake of that outbound supertanker at bearing 105. The tactical situation was deteriorating. The third submarine was using the massive noise of a civilian oil tanker to hide its own acoustic signature. It was a classic move. By staying close to the larger ship, the small submarine became a ghost, invisible to the Mason sensors. "Bridge. Combat," the tactical action officer called out. "Contact 1 is accelerating. 30 knots. They are on an intercept course. They are coming up to periscope depth. He's going to take a shot," Vance said. He stepped back into the darkened bridge.
Codes confirmed.
"Ready the Mark 54 torpedo tubes on the port side. Tell the helicopter to ready their primary weapon. We have to hit the one we can see before the one we can't see hits us." The air in the ship was thick. It smelled of sweat and old coffee. The emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows against the bulkheads. Every sailor knew what was coming. The transition from the hunt to the kill was seconds away. "Targeting solution for Contact 1 is locked," Miller reported. His voice was shaking now. "The outer doors on the submarine are open. I hear high-speed screws. Torpedo in the water! Torpedo in the water! Bearing 075. Hard to starboard," Vance roared. "Deploy flares and acoustic decoys. All hands, brace for impact." The Mason tilted violently to the right as the rudder swung over. The sea screamed against the hull. The battle was no longer a game of shadows. It was a fight for survival. 4:22 in the morning. The dark heart of the Strait of Hormuz. The world inside the USS Mason tilted at a sickening angle. 30,000 tons of steel groaned as the rudder slammed to the limit. In the galley, stacks of metal trays slid off the counters and hit the floor with a deafening crash. Sailors in the passageways braced their shoulders against the bulkheads, their boots sliding on the deck. The vibration from the 4 gas turbine engines reached a screaming crescendo. It was no longer a hum. It was a physical force that rattled the glass in the bridge consoles and shook the breath from the lungs of the crew. "Torpedo is active and homing," Miller shouted from the sonar suite. "Range 1,000 yards. It is moving at 45 knots. It has a solid acoustic lock." The incoming torpedo was an Iranian-made YTG. It was a fast, wake-homing weapon designed to find the churning water behind a destroyer and follow it until it found the propellers. On the sonar screen, the line representing the torpedo was a jagged, aggressive streak of white light. It was closing the distance in heartbeats. "Deploy the Nixie. Now. Now." The tactical action officer screamed into his headset. At the stern of the Mason, a heavy winch whirred into life. The SLQ-25 Nixie, a long, black acoustic decoy, was launched into the churning wake of the ship. It hit the water and began to scream. It emitted a high-decibel pulse designed to mimic the exact acoustic signature of the Mason's engines. It was a digital ghost, a lure meant to pull the steel predator away from the real ship. "Range 500 yards," Miller called out. His voice was pitched high with adrenaline. "The torpedo is turning. It is biting on the decoy. It is breaking left." From the bridge wing, Captain Vance looked back toward the stern. 100 yards behind the ship, the black water suddenly erupted. A massive pillar of white foam and fire shot 30 feet into the air. The shockwave hit the Mason a second later. It felt like a giant had slammed a sledgehammer into the keel of the ship. The destroyer shuddered, a deep, metallic thrumming that lasted for 5 seconds before the sea settled back into a boiling mess of white froth and burnt chemical residue. The smell of high explosives and scorched salt water drifted over the flight deck. "Decoy destroyed. We are clear," the tactical action officer reported. His voice was ragged. "But Contact 1 is diving. They are trying to reload." "Not on my watch," Vance said. He turned back to the tactical display. The adrenaline was a cold fire in his veins. "We are not playing defense anymore. We are the hunters. Bridge to Seahawk. You have the solution on Contact 1. Shoot. Shoot now." 5 miles away, the MH-60 Sierra helicopter was still hovering in the dark. The pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Viper Jenkins, adjusted her grip on the collective. Her cockpit was a tight, cramped world of green light and vibrating metal. She could smell the hot hydraulic fluid and the sharp tang of the sea. "Copy that, Mason. We have a solid fix on Contact 1, Jenkins said. Her voice was steady, filtered through the electronic hiss of the radio. "Master, arm on. Selecting Station 1. Mark 54 torpedo is live." In the back of the helicopter, the sensor operator flipped the safety cover off the release switch. The Mark 54 was a lightweight torpedo, but it carried enough high explosive to crack a midget submarine like an egg. It was a sophisticated machine, a silver cylinder of death that was currently waiting for the command to fall. "Release, release, release." The helicopter jolted upward as the weight of the torpedo vanished. The Mark 54 fell through the dark air, a silent shape in the night. It hit the water with a clean entry, its small turbine engine igniting instantly. The high-pitched whine of the torpedo's propeller began to echo through the water, a sound that Miller picked up on his headset 5 miles away. "Torpedo away from the Seahawk," Miller reported. "It is running straight and true. I have the submarine. They are trying to crash dive. They are terrified." The Iranian submarine crew realized their mistake too late. They had revealed their position to take a shot, and now the ocean was no longer their shield. The Mark 54 was moving at 40 knots, its internal sonar pinging with a rapid, lethal frequency. It was the sound of a closing trap. "Range to impact, 300 yards, Miller said, his eyes fixed on the merging lines on his screen. "Contact 1 is trying to blow ballast. They are coming up. They are panicking." The Strait of Hormuz was no longer quiet. The sound of high-speed propellers and active sonar pings filled the water, a chaotic symphony of modern naval warfare. Beneath the surface, the dark shape of the first Ghadir-class submarine was silhouetted against the ambient light of the phosphorescent sea. It looked like a wounded whale, turning and twisting in a desperate attempt to outrun the silver streak that was chasing it. 100 yards, Miller whispered. The air in the Combat Information Center seemed to vanish. Every man held his breath. The silence of the room was a stark contrast to the violence unfolding beneath the waves. They were waiting for the collision of two worlds. 4:23 in the morning. The deep channel of the Strait of Hormuz. The Mark 54 torpedo was no longer a machine. It was a predator with a singular, mathematical purpose. Inside its nose cone, the active sonar seeker was screaming at a frequency that turned the surrounding water into a wall of noise. 100 yards. 50 yards. The Iranian Ghadir-class submarine, 115 feet of cold steel and desperate men, tried to bank hard toward the seafloor, but it was like a freighter trying to outrun a bullet. The warhead punched straight through the thin steel of the submarine's pressure hull just aft of the sail. The impact was not a dull thud. It was a violent, metallic shriek as 44 kilograms of high-performance explosive detonated inside a confined space. A massive, white-hot bubble of gas expanded instantly, tearing the submarine into two distinct pieces. The force of the blast sent a shockwave through the water that was felt by the sonar operator on the USS Mason 5 miles away. On Miller's screen, the bright white dot, that was the submarine, suddenly blossomed into a jagged, chaotic cloud before vanishing entirely. Impact. "Contact 1 is destroyed," Miller shouted. He ripped his headset off for a second, rubbing his ears. "Direct hit. I am hearing heavy breaking up noises. The hull is collapsing." Beneath the surface, the destruction was absolute. The two halves of the Iranian vessel were thrown in opposite directions. The forward section, containing the torpedo tubes and the battery compartments, tilted nose down and began a rapid terminal slide toward the rocky bottom, 300 feet below. The stern section, with the propeller still spinning uselessly in the void, was engulfed in a cloud of black diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid that rose toward the surface like a dark shroud. The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds. "Bridge! Combat! Contact 2 and Contact 3 are reacting," the tactical action officer yelled. "They are breaking silence. I have high-speed screws on both. They are going to maximum depth. They are splitting up." The second Ghadir-class submarine, positioned 2,000 yards to the north, turned its nose away from the site of its sister ship's grave. The captain of that vessel knew the Seahawk helicopter was still overhead. He pushed his engines to the red line. The electric motor, whining as it drove the submarine down toward the thermal layer, a boundary of cold water that could bounce sonar waves and hide a ship from the world above. The third submarine, which had been hiding in the acoustic shadow of the civilian supertanker, made a different choice. It banked hard toward the Iranian coastline, moving into the shallower, rockier waters where the Mason's powerful sonar would struggle to distinguish a steel hull from the jagged underwater cliffs. "They are running," Vance said, his voice cold and focused. He was back in the Combat Information Center now, standing behind the sonar. "Technicians, Contact 2 is trying to hide in the deep. Contact 3 is heading for the rocks. We cannot let them regroup. The air in the room was thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the overworked computers. Every man was drenched in sweat. The initial thrill of the first kill had been replaced by the grim realization that 2 predators were still in the water, and they were no longer playing by the rules of stealth. Seahawk, this is Mason, Vance radioed. Target Contact 2. Use your remaining torpedo. We will handle Contact 3 with the ship's tubes. We need to end this before they reach the territorial limit. Copy, Mason, Lieutenant Jenkins replied from the cockpit of the MH-60 Sierra. We are moving into position. Over Contact 2. We have a faint acoustic lead. Dropping the second dipping sonar now. The helicopter banked sharply, its rotor blades biting into the humid air. Below them, the sea was marked by a growing slick of oil and debris where the first submarine had gone down. A few orange life vests and pieces of wooden lagging bobbed in the white foam, the only evidence that 20 men had been there moments before. On the bridge of the Mason, the helmsman felt the ship shudder as the engines surged again. The destroyer was a hunter now, its bow cutting through the waves at 35 knots. The wake was a long, white scar that stretched back toward the horizon. Range to Contact 3 is 4,000 yards, Miller reported. He's getting into the rocks, Captain. If he gets another mile closer to the coast, we'll lose him in the bottom clutter. Ready the deck tubes, Vance ordered. 3 torpedo spread. I want a wall of steel between that sub and the shore. Fire when ready. The port side torpedo tubes on the USS Mason swiveled outward. The heavy steel canisters pointed toward the dark horizon. With a hiss of compressed air, 3 more Mark 54 torpedoes were punched into the sea. They hit the water with 3 distinct splashes, their engines igniting, with a collective roar that vibrated through the hull of the destroyer. The Strait of Hormuz was now a graveyard in the making. 4:25 in the morning. The deep channel of the Strait of Hormuz. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter hung in the air like a massive predatory insect. The downdraft from the rotor blades whipped the surface of the Persian Gulf into a frantic circle of white foam and spray. Inside the cockpit, the air was a pressurized mix of recycled oxygen, the copper tang of electronic heat, and the faint, sweet smell of jet fuel. Lieutenant Jenkins watched her tactical display. The green icon for the second Iranian submarine was flickering, struggling to stay visible as it dove toward the 300-meter mark. He's trying to bottom out, Jenkins said. Her voice was a calm contrast to the screaming machinery around her. Station 2. Selector to arm. Mark 54 torpedo. Internal power confirmed. In the back of the aircraft, the sensor operator gripped the release lever. His knuckles were white against the black plastic. He could feel the vibration of the helicopter through his flight suit, a constant, bone-shaking hum. Solution is solid. Pitch and yaw corrected for windage, the operator reported. Weapons free. The trigger was squeezed. The Mark 54 torpedo shrieked off its rack, a silver cylinder of high-strength steel falling through the dark. It hit the water with a sharp, clean entry, the sound of the impact swallowed by the roar of the helicopter's engines. For a fraction of a second, there was a trail of white bubbles on the surface, and then the torpedo's thermal battery ignited. The high-pitched whine of its propeller began to echo through the deep, a predatory scream that cut through the silence of the underwater world. The torpedo punched straight through the upper casing of the second submarine's engine room, just forward of the screw. The detonation was instantaneous. 44 kilograms of high-explosive-shaped charge tore through the pressure hull like a hot needle through silk. The impact did not just break the ship, it vaporized the surrounding water into a massive, superheated gas bubble that expanded with a force of 10,000 pounds per square inch. The hull of the Ghadir-class vessel buckled inward, the steel plates snapping along the weld lines with a sound like a freight train crashing into a mountain. The reaction from the remaining Iranian forces was immediate and chaotic. 3 miles away, the captain of the third submarine, the one hiding near the coastal rocks, saw the acoustic flare of his comrade's death on his own sonar. The professional discipline of the Iranian crew vanished in a heartbeat. The submarine lurched forward, blowing its emergency ballast tanks in a desperate attempt to reach the surface and surrender, or perhaps to find enough speed to beach the vessel before the American destroyers could fire again. The submarine's nose pitched up violently, its propeller churning the shallow water into a frothy mess of mud and silt as it clawed for the surface. Black smoke and a massive surge of compressed air erupted from the depths where the second submarine had been. A giant, roiling plume of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid reached the surface, turning the white foam of the Gulf into a dark, iridescent stain. The sea was littered with the shattered remains of the vessel, pieces of acoustic tiling, wooden crates, and twisted shards of aluminum that glinted briefly in the searchlights of the hovering Seahawk. For a moment, there was a dead silence on the radio channels, an absolute stillness that lasted until the first reports of the third submarine's movements began to crackle through the headsets. Mason, Seahawk, Contact 2 is confirmed destroyed, Jenkins reported. She banked the helicopter away from the rising oil slick, her eyes already scanning the horizon for the final target. One hull remains. He is surfacing near the rocks, at coordinate 26 degrees north. He is moving fast, but he has nowhere left to go. On the bridge of the USS Mason, Captain Vance watched the final green dot on his screen. The third submarine was no longer a ghost. It was a cornered animal, exposed and vulnerable against the backdrop of the Iranian cliffs. The air on the bridge was cool, but Vance could feel the heat of the engagement radiating from his crew. The mission was nearly over, but the most dangerous moment of any battle was the final seconds before the last shot was fired. Combat. Bridge. "Do we have a lock on the third hull?" Vance asked. "Solid lock, Captain," Miller replied. "He's on the surface now. He's running on his diesels. He's trying to reach the 3-mile limit. Close the distance," Vance ordered. "If he doesn't strike his colors in the next 60 seconds, we finish it." The USS Mason surged forward, its bow cutting through the water like a knife. The final act of the engagement was beginning, and the dark waters of the strait were ready to claim their final prize. 4:26 in the morning. The Iranian coast. The jagged silhouettes of the Musandam Peninsula rose out of the darkness, like broken teeth against a purple sky. The third Ghadir-class submarine was no longer a silent shadow in the deep. It was a frantic, metal beast clawing at the surface of the water. Its twin diesel engines had kicked over with a violent cough of black smoke that hung in the humid air, thick with the smell of unburnt fuel and the iron tang of the nearby cliffs. The submarine was less than 3 miles from the safety of the territorial limit, its hull shivering as it pushed through the Tariand, heavy swells at its maximum surface speed of 10 knots. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the green glow of the radar repeaters illuminated the faces of the bridge crew. The ship was leaning into a hard turn, its bow throwing up massive sheets of white spray that caught the faint light of the moon. Captain Vance stood at the edge of the bridge wing, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the high-powered optics, he could see the low profile of the Iranian vessel. It looked small and insignificant against the scale of the ocean, but the 2 torpedo tubes in its nose remained a lethal threat. "He's not stopping," the executive officer said, his voice tight. "He's ignoring the hail on all frequencies. At this speed, he crosses the line in 8 minutes. He's not going to make it," Vance replied. "Sonar. What's he doing?" In the Combat Information Center, Miller pressed his headset closer to his ears. The sound of the submarine's diesel engines was a rhythmic, metallic thumping that dominated the acoustic environment. But underneath that sound, there was something else. A high-pitched, grinding noise. "Bridge. Combat. The third hull is experiencing mechanical distress," Miller reported. "I am hearing cavitation and a metal-on-metal scream from their starboard shaft. They must have pushed the motors too hard. During the escape, they are losing speed." On the surface, the Iranian submarine suddenly lurched to the left. A plume of white steam erupted from the exhaust vent near the stern. The vessel slowed visibly, its bow dipping into the waves as the forward momentum died away. The crew on the deck of the submarine, visible through the Mason's night vision cameras, were scrambling toward the small hatch on the sail. They were not surrendering. They were trying to vent the smoke from the interior. "He's foundering," the tactical action officer noted. "But he's still moving toward the rocks. He's trying to beach it. We cannot let them scuttle that boat in shallow water, where the intelligence can be destroyed," Vance said. He stepped back into the darkened bridge to Seahawk. "Do you have eyes on the deck? We are hovering 500 yards off his port quarter." Lieutenant Jenkins radioed back from the MH-60 Sierra. "The crew is topside. They are tossing crates overboard. It looks like they are trying to ditch their encryption gear and logs before they hit the rocks. The water here is only 40 meters deep. If they sink it here, they can dive on it tomorrow." The atmosphere on the Mason was one of cold, professional intensity. The sailors knew the rules. In the narrow, contested waters of the Strait of Hormuz, a crippled enemy was often more dangerous than a healthy one. The threat of a last-ditch torpedo launch or a suicide maneuver was always present. "Warning shots," Vance ordered. 5-inch gun. Drop one 500 yards ahead of his bow. Let him know the door is closed. The forward gun turret of the USS Mason, a 5-inch Mark 45, swiveled with a mechanical hum. The long barrel rose toward the horizon, its movement guided by the ship's radar tracking system. Inside the turret, the automated loading system slammed a 70-pound high-explosive shell into the breech. "Gun target line is clear," the weapons officer announced. Firing. The ship shuddered as the gun roared. A massive flash of orange flame lit up the entire forward deck, reflecting off the spray and the sea. The sound was a physical blow, a concussive boom that rolled across the water and echoed off the Iranian cliffs. 3 seconds later, a geyser of white water erupted half a mile ahead of the limping submarine. The Iranian vessel did not stop. Instead, the hatch on the sail slammed shut. The men on deck vanished, inside the hull. The diesel engines, despite the mechanical scream coming from the shaft, surged one last time. The submarine began to settle, back into the water. "He's diving!" Miller shouted. "Contact 3 is going under!" "He's trying to hide in the rock clutter again. He's choosing the hard way," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Condition 1, ASW. Target the hull. We end this now." The USS Mason increased speed, the vibration of the engines rising to a scream as the destroyer prepared for the final engagement. The hunt was over. The kill was all that remained. 4:28 in the morning. The jagged coastline of the Muzandam Peninsula. The bridge of the USS Mason was a storm of red light and focused urgency. Outside the reinforced glass, the sea was a chaotic landscape of white foam and black shadows. The third Iranian Ghadir-class submarine was a desperate shape, its hull half submerged as it fought to disappear into the rocky clutter of the shallows. The air inside the destroyer was thick with the scent of ozone, and the heavy, mechanical thrum of the ship's 4 gas turbine engines pushing the vessel to 30 knots. Target is at 3,000 yards in closing. On the 3-mile limit, the tactical action officer shouted over the roar of the ventilation. He is beginning his final dive. "If he gets under the thermal layer in these rocks, we lose the shot." Captain Vance did not blink. His hands were clamped onto the cold steel railing of the command bridge. "Weapons free. Execute the final engagement. Port side tubes, 3 torpedo spread. Shift the Seahawk to a secondary observation position. I want this hull accounted for before it touches the bottom." The order was given. The portside Mark 32 surface vessel torpedo tubes hissed with a sudden, violent release of compressed air that sent a cloud of white vapor screaming across the deck. 3 Mark 54 torpedoes were punched into the humid night air, their silver bodies glinting briefly in the red glow of the ship's navigation lights before they slammed into the sea with 3 distinct, heavy splashes. The heat blast from the launch washed across the faces of the sailors on the upper decks, carrying the sharp, chemical bite of burning propellant. Below the waterline, the 3 torpedoes came alive. Their internal thermal batteries ignited, sending a high-pitched, predatory scream through the water as their propellers spun up to 40 knots. They moved in a lethal fan pattern, their active sonar seekers pinging with a rapid, frantic frequency that turned the quiet depths into a wall of sound. The Mark 54 torpedo punched straight through the sail of the 3rd submarine just as its bridge fairing vanished beneath the waves. The explosion was a brilliant white flash that bleached the dark water for a fraction of a second, followed immediately by a concussive shock wave that threw the nearby Seahawk helicopter 50 feet upward in the air. 44 kilograms of high-performance explosive tore open the submarine's pressure hull like it was made of parchment. The sound of metal tearing was a jagged, screeching howl that echoed through the Mason's hull. A sound of absolute structural failure. The submarine did not sink gracefully. It buckled in the middle, the bow and stern rising like the ends of a broken toy. As the internal bulkheads collapsed under the combined pressure of the explosion and the sea, the vessel groaned, a deep, metallic moan of dying machinery. From the ruptured sail, a massive geyser of trapped air and vaporized hydraulic fluid erupted, shooting 20 feet above the surface in a fountain of white spray and black oil. The secondary batteries inside the submarine shorted out, sending a series of muffled underwater thuds through the water, as internal fires gutted what was left of the pressurized compartments. The reaction from the remaining Iranian forces was a state of total, paralyzed shock. On the surface, the debris from the 3rd hull began to rain down pieces of the periscope assembly, shattered acoustic tiles, and a single, twisted, orange life ring that bobbed in the center of a growing, iridescent oil slick. The sound of the explosion rolled across the surface, a heavy, flat thud that vibrated through the hull of the Mason and rattled the teeth of the crew. The water where the submarine had been was now a boiling cauldron of mud, silt, and the dark, thick blood of the machine. Immediate silence followed the last echoes of the blast. The sonar waterfall display in the Combat Information Center went flat, the jagged lines of the submarine's engine noise replaced by the static hiss of the ocean. The 3rd hull was gone, its remains settling into a jagged ravine 400 feet below the surface. Target 3 is confirmed. Destroyed. Miller reported from the sonar station. His voice was a whisper, the adrenaline finally leaving his system and leaving him hollow. It's over. There are no other submerged contacts in the sector. The air on the bridge of the Mason began to clear as the smoke from the torpedo launch dissipated into the night wind. Captain Vance let out a long, slow breath. He looked out at the Iranian coast, where the first hints of a gray dawn were beginning to touch the tops of the cliffs. The threat had been neutralized, the ambush broken, and the depths of the strait belonged once again to the silence of the sea. 4:30 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Mason began to bleed off speed, the massive vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines subsiding into a low, rhythmic hum. The white wake that had trailed the destroyer for miles began to settle, the churned water smoothing out into a glassy, dark surface. On the bridge, the red tactical lighting was replaced by the dim, white glow of the overheads as the ship moved from general quarters to a modified alert status. The air was heavy, smelling of ozone, hot metal, and the sharp, lingering bite of burnt propellant from the torpedo launches. Captain Vance stepped out onto the starboard bridge wing. The wind had died down, and the Gulf was eerily still. A mile to the east, the gray silhouettes of the Iranian cliffs were becoming sharper as the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The sky was no longer black. It was a deep, bruised purple, fading into a pale indigo.
And any signs of survivors?
Vance asked, his voice sounding raspy in the sudden quiet. Negative, Captain, the executive officer replied, stepping out beside him. The Seahawk is orbiting the last impact site. They are reporting a massive debris field and a heavy oil slick, but no life signs. The hull collapses were total. In that depth, with those warheads, there was no chance for a controlled escape. Through his binoculars, Vance scanned the water. The sea was littered with the evidence of the engagement. Thousands of small, black fragments of acoustic tiling floated on the surface, like charred leaves. A large, jagged piece of the third submarine's sail bobbed 50 yards away. Its steel skin twisted and blackened by the heat of the explosion. There was no movement, no voices, only the sound of the waves lapping against the hull of the Mason and the distant, fading thrum of the helicopter. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was a mix of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. Miller sat back in his chair, his hands finally resting in his lap. His headset hung around his neck. The waterfall display on his screen was a clean, blue sheet. The three predators that had stalked them in the dark were gone, erased by the mathematics of modern acoustic warfare. "Sector is clear," Miller said to the room. "No submerged contacts. No surface signatures within 10 miles. The tankers are resuming their transit." To the north, the lights of the civilian supertanker that the third submarine had used for cover were moving away. The crew of that vessel likely had no idea that a life and death struggle had just occurred in the water beneath their keel. The commerce of the world continued, oblivious to the violence that had secured the passage. Secure from anti-submarine warfare stations, Vance ordered over the ship internal circuit. "Maintain a heightened watch on the surface radar. I want a full sitrep drafted for Pacific Command within 30 minutes. We need to be clear about who fired first and why." The iron silence of the post-battle environment was a physical weight. Every sailor on the Mason felt the adrenaline leave their system, replaced by the heavy ache of fatigue. They had been at battle stations for less than an hour, but in that time, the world had changed. 3 crews were at the battle, bottom of the strait, and the political fallout of the engagement would likely ripple across the globe before the sun was fully up. The Seahawk helicopter banked one last time over the oil slick before turning back toward the destroyer. Its landing, lights flicked on, cutting 2 bright paths through the morning mist. The pilot, Lieutenant Jenkins, felt the weight of the empty torpedo racks on her aircraft. She looked down at the dark water one last time, seeing only the reflection of the morning star in the center of the diesel stain. Mason, Seahawk, Jenkins radioed. "Coming home. The sea is quiet. 5 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz." The horizon was a thin, jagged line of orange fire as the sun began to climb over the mountains of Oman. The USS Mason was moving at a slow, steady 5 knots, her bow cutting through the oily, dark surface of the Persian Gulf. The violent kinetic energy of the last hour had dissipated, leaving behind a heavy, salt-crusted silence. On the flight deck, the LSO, or landing signal officer, raised his paddles. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter, its fuel low and its torpedo racks empty, hovered 200 yards off the starboard quarter. The helicopter turned slowly, its nose dipping as it aligned with the rolling deck of the destroyer. The downdraft from the rotors flattened the small waves, creating a circular halo of white spray. With a practiced, rhythmic grace, the pilot brought the aircraft down. The wheels touched the non-skid surface with a sharp metallic chirp. Immediately, the deck crew in their green and yellow jerseys swarmed the aircraft, ducking low under the spinning blades to snap the heavy tie-down chains into the deck cleats. The engines of the Seahawk began their long, whining descent into silence. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Jenkins pulled her helmet off. Her hair was matted with sweat, and her eyes were rimmed with the red fatigue of extreme adrenaline. She looked out at the flight deck, where the morning light was revealing the true scale of the engagement. The sea was no longer black. It was a pale, sickly green, marked by 3 distinct, massive patches of iridescent oil that stretched for miles toward the Iranian coast. "Engines off," Jenkins said into the dead intercom. She sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. The mission was done. On the bridge, Captain Vance stood at the central console. He was reviewing the initial damage report on a digital tablet. The USS Mason had suffered no direct hits, but the high-speed maneuvers and the shock waves from the nearby torpedo detonations had taken a toll. 2 internal fuel lines had hairline fractures. The sonar dome had a minor acoustic leak from the pressure of the depth charges. A dozen computer monitors in the Combat Information Center had shattered during the final collision of the shockwave, but the ship was fully operational. Executive Officer, what is the status of the data logs? Vance asked. Encrypted and uploaded to the 7th Fleet server, Captain, the executive officer replied. The satellite burst went through 3 minutes ago. Every second of the sonar data, the radar tracks, and the bridge audio is now in the hands of the Pentagon. There will be no question about who initiated the sequence. Good, Vance said. He looked out the window. The 3 oil slicks were the only markers left of the 3 Iranian crews. Tell the engineering team to begin a full inspection of the prop shafts. We pushed the turbines to 105% for 20 minutes. I want to know if we burned out the bearings. The atmosphere on the ship was transitioning from the frantic heat of combat to the cold, methodical reality of the aftermath. In the galley, the smell of fresh coffee and burnt toast began to drift through the passageways, a mundane scent that felt strangely out of place after the smell of high explosives. Sailors who had been at their stations for 12 hours straight began to rotate out, their faces pale and their movements slow. They did not talk about the victory. They talked about sleep. In the sonar suite, Miller was still staring at his screen. The waterfall display was a steady, rhythmic blue. He took a sip of lukewarm water and leaned back. He would have to sit through 6 hours of debriefing. He would have to explain every ping and every transient. He would have to justify the deaths of 60 men he had never seen, men who were now part of the silt on the ocean floor. Bridge. Combat, Miller said, his voice cracking slightly. I am officially clearing the last contact from the board. Sector is Zulu. The water is clear. Acknowledge. Combat, Vance replied. Well done, Miller. Get some rack time. The USS Mason increased speed to 15 knots, turning her bow away from the Iranian coast and toward the open waters of the Arabian Sea. The destroyer moved with a quiet, lethal dignity, the white foam of her wake the only sign of her passage. The Strait of Hormuz was open. The tankers would continue to move. The world's oil would continue to flow. As the sun fully cleared the horizon, the orange light hit the gray steel of the Mason, making the ship glow like a ghost. Behind her, the oil slicks began to break apart in the strong currents of the tide. By noon, there would be nothing left to show that a battle had ever happened. The sea, as it always did, had reclaimed its secrets. Set course 270, Vance ordered. Take us out to deep water. The Mason moved west, a solitary sentinel disappearing into the morning haze.